There comes a moment, silent, invisible, when the one who always gave stops. The empath who once absorbed chaos begins to channel clarity. And when that shift happens, the very power that once served others now builds something far greater. This message isn't about revenge, it's about revelation. There is a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when the empath, the one who always stayed quiet, begins to stir. The one who felt everything, absorbed the pain, carried the burdens, and kept the peace, finally wakes up. And let me tell you, when an empath wakes up, they don't come back the same. They were never weak. They were patient. They were discerning. They were measuring. But after being drained, manipulated, and misunderstood over and over again, something breaks. And that break births a new kind of power. The empath who once cried silently in the corner now rises with clarity in their eyes and purpose in their voice. They stop blaming themselves. They stop justifying toxic behavior. They stop over-explaining to people who were never listening. And they begin to guard their peace like a soldier guards a fortress. Because once they've had enough, they're not walking in circles anymore. They're moving forward, strategically, intentionally, powerfully. What makes them dangerous is not anger. It's awareness. It's the realization that their empathy was a gift, not a weakness. That their love wasn't foolish, it was rare. That they weren't meant to be anyone's emotional trash can. They were meant to be vessels of healing, yes, but not at the expense of their own soul. When they stop giving out of guilt and start giving from wisdom, that's when the tables turn. That's when boundaries replace begging. That's when silence becomes a language of strength. And the narcissist, the manipulator, the one who thought they had control, they suddenly realize the game is over. The pawn they used to move around was actually a queen in disguise. And here's the truth. The empath's power was never in loudness. It was in restraint. But now, with knowledge, with experience, with spiritual fire, that restraint becomes refined strength. That strength turns into movement. And that movement, it begins to impact everything around them. But what happens next when the peacekeeper transforms into a purpose-driven warrior? What shifts when the one who once healed others starts healing themselves? You're going to want to hear this. There comes a breaking point, a moment where the empath, who's been the absorber of pain, the fixer of chaos, the bridge between hearts, says, no more. Not with bitterness, not with hate, but with truth. And that truth, it shakes the entire foundation of every relationship that depended on their silence. You see, for so long, the empath thought their role was to hold everything together, to take the hit, smooth the edge, carry the extra weight. They believed that love meant suffering, that peace required sacrifice, that loyalty demanded silence. But then one day, after one manipulation too many, one lie too far, they finally asked themselves, why am I bleeding to keep others whole? And that question, it ignites a fire, a holy unrest, a divine interruption to the cycle of emotional slavery. The empath doesn't snap. They awaken. And when they awaken, they no longer absorb pain. They identify it. They no longer internalize chaos. They confront it, not with rage, but with revelation. They begin to see who's been feeding off their kindness, who's been twisting their compassion, who's been dancing in the shadows while they carried the light. And with that vision comes clarity. And with clarity comes decisions. And with those decisions comes freedom. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop fixing what they didn't break. They stop apologizing for feeling too much, caring too deeply, or loving too purely. And in that moment, they don't just walk away. They rise. They rise with discernment. They rise with wisdom. They rise with wisdom. They rise with a backbone built from every betrayal, every tear, every silent prayer they whispered in the dark. And suddenly, the one who used to hold everything in becomes the one who lets everything go. But here's the twist. When they release what wounded them, they step into what was always theirs. Purpose, power, position. The very thing the enemy tried to bury under emotional exhaustion begins to bloom. But what happens next when love is no longer a wound but becomes a shield? What if the empath, now awakened, starts to choose themselves first? Stay with me, because the shift is just getting started. There comes a day when the empath, who spent years keeping the peace, finally decides to become something greater, a purpose-driven warrior. Because peace without purpose, that's just survival. And they weren't created to survive, they were created to impact. For too long, they thought their only role was to soothe storms, to quiet conflict, to be the calm in the middle of everyone else's chaos. But what they didn't realize is that their ability to keep peace wasn't weakness. It was power without direction. And once that power is aligned with purpose, it becomes unstoppable. They begin to see differently. They stop trying to save people who keep choosing dysfunction. They stop shrinking their light to comfort the darkness around them. They realize they're not here just to comfort brokenness. They're here to call it out, to break cycles, to shift atmospheres, to walk into rooms and change what happens just by being there. Now they speak with boldness, not loud, not rude, but clear. Their yes means yes. Their no means no. They don't explain it away. They don't ask for permission to honor their boundaries, because now their energy has value, their time has weight, and their soul is off limits to chaos. They don't fight like they used to, emotionally, reactively. They've traded reaction for strategy. They've traded tears for vision. They've laid down the role of peacekeeper and picked up the mantle of warrior, not to destroy people, but to protect their purpose, to guard their calling, to walk in alignment. And now, the same empath who used to tolerate dysfunction starts transforming environments. The same one who was constantly drained becomes a source of power. They stop carrying what's not theirs and start building what is. And when they enter a room, you feel it, not because they demand attention, but because they command presence. But here's what shifts everything. What happens when that love, once used to repair others, becomes a force to elevate themselves? What happens when they choose destiny over familiarity? Because next, we're stepping into a truth most people aren't ready for. When love stops being a wound and becomes a shield, there comes a turning point when love, the very thing that once left them bleeding, becomes their shield. Not a wall built from bitterness, not armor made of resentment, but a shield forged in wisdom. The empath, once wounded by the very people they pour themselves into, begins to understand love is sacred and it must first flow inward before it overflows outward. They no longer love blindly. They love wisely because now they've learned love is not supposed to drain you. It's supposed to direct you. Love isn't a license for someone else to abuse your kindness. It's a gift, a force, a divine energy. But when given to the wrong people, it can become a weapon used against you. So the empath steps back, not from love, but from enabling. They stop saying yes when their spirit says no. They stop overreaching to hold together what God may be trying to pull apart. They no longer confuse loyalty with self-destruction. Because true love doesn't erase you. It protects you. It nourishes you. It gives back. And when they embrace that truth, their love changes. It becomes focused. It becomes guarded, not cold, but discerning. They don't open the door to just anyone. They don't give their heart to people who only take. They learn to love with a filter, with boundaries, with purpose. They begin to see themselves as worthy, not just of giving love, but receiving it. And when they walk into relationships now, they're not desperate for validation. They bring value because they know who they are. And they refuse to shrink for anyone who doesn't see it. And that kind of love, it's not fragile. It's not naive. It's bold. It's mature. It's rooted. And when they love like that, when they guard their heart while still staying open to truth, they become unstoppable. But the question is, what happens when that kind of love, disciplined, clear, grounded, becomes dangerous to the systems that once thrived on their silence? What happens when their calm turns into conviction, and that conviction starts shifting everything around them? You're about to find out. Because the calm before the rise is over. There's a stillness, a silence that comes right before the shift. It's not weakness. It's not confusion. It's preparation. It's the moment right before the empath rises, not as the peacekeeper, but as a force that cannot be manipulated anymore. That dangerous calm, that's the sound of alignment. That's the echo of boundaries being rebuilt. That's the quiet roar of someone who's done explaining, done fixing, done shrinking. They used to walk on eggshells just to keep things smooth. They used to absorb tension just to keep the room light. But now they've learned that peace purchased by silence is not peace at all. It's bondage. And when that realization hits, everything changes. Now they move differently. They don't respond to every insult. They don't chase after closure. They don't try to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding them. Why? Because they know who they are. And more importantly, they know who they are not. That calm, that's not indifference, it's clarity. That silence, that's not surrender, it's strategy. That stillness, that's not fear, it's focus. They are no longer distracted by noise. They are no longer moved by chaos. They're listening not to the world, but to their assignment. And here's the truth. When the empath gets quiet, the manipulator gets nervous. Because their power was never in loudness, it was in presence. And now, that presence isn't tied to approval, it's tied to purpose. The very thing others try to suppress is now being refined. They don't rush, they don't beg, they build quietly, consistently, powerfully. And when they re-emerge from that season of stillness, they don't come back seeking attention. They come back carrying authority. But you got to ask yourself, what happens next? When that authority is used not to survive anymore, but to transform. What happens when the oppressed start breaking chains, not just for themselves, but for others? That moment is coming, and it's not far off. There's something powerful, almost prophetic, about the moment the oppressed stop asking for permission to be free. When the empath, worn down by cycles of manipulation, finally stands up, not just for themselves, but for the generations connected to them, that's when heaven takes notice. They were never just fighting for peace in their own lives. They were carrying the weight of unspoken trauma, generational pain, inherited silence. But now they see it. They recognize the patterns, the emotional codependency, the mental exhaustion, the spiritual suffocation, and they say, it ends with me. They realize they weren't just targeted because of their softness. They were targeted because of their strength. Because when an empath wakes up, they don't just leave dysfunction, they dismantle it. They speak truth into atmospheres that were built on lies. They shine light into spaces that survived on secrecy. And what makes them truly dangerous is that they've seen both sides. They've sat in the silence. They've endured the manipulation. But now, they're stepping into revelation. And with that revelation comes authority. The authority to break emotional cycles, to sever toxic ties, to declare that peace is not passive, it's powerful. Now they become the one in the family who sets new standards, the one in the relationship who says, this is not love, the one in the room who no longer absorbs dysfunction, but challenges it. They become the thermostat, not the thermometer. They don't just reflect the environment, they transform it. And those who once underestimated them, who thought their kindness was weakness, who thought their patience meant permission, they start to see they were dealing with someone anointed for disruption. The empath rises not to tear down, but to rebuild, to reset the order, to bring divine alignment where disorder once ruled. But the real shift is just beginning, because what happens when the empath, no longer burdened by the past, starts to dream again, to believe again, to build again? Get ready, because the victim is gone and a visionary is being born. There's a transformation so subtle, yet so powerful, when the one who once called themselves a victim starts walking like a visionary. When the empath finally realizes that all the pain, the betrayal, the confusion wasn't meant to destroy them, but to develop them. That's when the atmosphere shifts. They start seeing differently, no longer asking, why did this happen to me, but boldly declaring, this is happening for me. Every rejection, redirection. Every heartbreak, revelation. Every silence, preparation. They begin to understand the pain was the path. It was shaping them, refining them, stripping away the false so the real could rise. They stop chasing people and start chasing purpose. They stop mourning what left and begin building what's next. Because now, they're not living from their wounds, they're living from their wisdom. And that wisdom, that's what births the visionary. They begin to carry ideas, strategies, solutions. They dream again. Not fantasies, but blueprints. They walk into rooms no longer trying to prove their worth, but to release their value. Their voice changes, their presence changes, and suddenly the one who was once overlooked becomes the one who sets the standard. They no longer seek permission to grow. They grow. They evolve. They shift. And the same empathy that once made them vulnerable to manipulation now makes them magnetic to purpose-driven connections. They attract what aligns, and they repel what drains. They no longer ask, will they accept me? Now they ask, does this align with who I've become? Because they're not just surviving, they're leading, quietly, boldly, authentically. And the people who once took advantage of their compassion now watch in silence, because the one they tried to keep small is now building something unstoppable. The one they tried to silence is now speaking with authority, not to fight back, but to call others forward. But what happens when the one who used to carry everyone else's weight starts walking in their own assignment? What shifts? When purpose becomes their protection and vision becomes their voice. Get ready to see what happens when the exit becomes the elevation. There comes a moment when the exit isn't just a way out, it becomes a gateway up. When the empath finally walks away from what drained them, confused them, diminished them, they don't walk away empty. They walk away equipped. Because the exit wasn't the end, it was the beginning of elevation. They leave behind the noise, the guilt, the constant second guessing. And in that space, they find something they'd forgotten they had: clarity. They see themselves again, not through the lens of manipulation, not through the fog of people-pleasing, but through the mirror of divine identity. They realize they were never meant to stay in survival mode. They were born to soar. What once held them hostage now becomes their testimony. What once silenced them now fuels their message. And those exits, they were not losses. They were ladders. Every closed door was a setup. Every delay was divine. Every heartbreak was heaven's way of repositioning them. And now, they're not just walking in healing, they're walking in assignment. They don't carry the same weight anymore. They don't entertain the same conversations. Their atmosphere has shifted. Their circle has shifted. Because they've shifted. They are no longer a prisoner to the past. They are architects of the future. They are not looking for validation. They are moving with vision. And that vision is not just about success. It's about impact. It's about legacy. It's about using every lesson, every scar, every silent tear to build something that lasts. They don't return to what broke them. They don't revisit what buried them. They rise quietly, consistently, completely. And now, every step they take is not just about where they're going, it's about who they've become. Because when the empath exits dysfunction, they don't just leave behind pain, they step into power. And now the real journey begins. This is not the end, it's the rise. This is not survival, it's destiny. You didn't lose, you were launched. You weren't rejected, you were redirected. So take the step and don't look back, because your elevation is already in motion.